Well, hello to our audiences, our viewers. Hi, if you're new to Local Theater Company, my name is Pesha. I'm the artistic director here at Local, and I'm going to dive in because we have an hour together, and I have 48 questions for you. So I do not. I do, but I somehow managed to get down to...
You've narrowed the list down a little bit.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to hold them up. And so I'm going to just dive in. So as a theater person or as a theater director, when I first meet a new play, and at Local we do exclusively new work, and I'm getting to know a piece of work or the playwright who's written the piece of work, I always start by looking at the characters and defining or sort of looking through the moments in their life. And some of these moments are big moments that create kind of seismic change and choices in a character's journey. And sometimes they're little tiny moments that have ripples and that ripple out. And so my first question for you, as a way of sort of getting to know you and your background, is if you don't mind sharing, when was the moment that you knew you were an artist?
This is such an interesting question. And I get asked it in different ways, it seems fairly regularly. It's like, I think as a child, one is so creative. And so one is an artist. You know, I always felt sense of play and adventure. And I liked doing experiments in the kitchen, for example. Like I was very curious about, could you grow popcorn? You know, like what things could you grow? My mom was, what are these crazy things? So I had this very experimental sort of free way of playing as a child. And then I kept that inside of me, you know, that idea of like the innocent playfulness of a child. And that sort of morphed as I studied art in high school and in college into something that was more formal, that was given a language, that, you know, was taught art history and history of film. And so I think there was a professionalization of a very playful child's experience that's become almost like I would say being an artist as an adult, it's like having a second child, you know, and that you protect sort of that curious way of being in the world. That's not childish anymore, but it's childlike. So I guess the answer would be that I became a professional when I began studying art more formally in high school, college, and then graduate school. So
yeah, and in terms of sort of being a professional, when in that journey did you start turning words into pictures, and when did words and text sort of emerge as your way of?
That was so interesting to me. You know, this is like a very back to childhood. I have this very strong memory of trying to understand the concept of God. I mean, I'm just going to go there with you, Pesha.
Let's do it.
I remember thinking, like, what came, because you would study, you know, you're like 6 or 7 and you're lying in bed at night. And I was thinking, well, what came before, you know, the dogs and the cats and the dinosaurs? Like, what came before? And I remember sort of working, like every night I would get a little further in my little mind's understanding. And I remember thinking, well, what came before God, you know? And just thinking, but God is a word. So what came before the word? And so this idea of, and it was a very, you know, a childlike understanding of it, but that play of like, can you have a concept without the word? You know, and did the universe come? But we're using words again. So I think that that was sort of like a childlike wonder of like, how does our thinking work? And is it words that come before images? I mean, it's like the chicken and the egg. You know, which came first? So that curiosity of how narrative too and storytelling shape the images. And not to get people too excited, but when we do our exercise at the end, we're going to be looking at this exact idea, right? Like, so everyone get your pen and paper, but it's like what comes first, and we think we know what another person mean, what another group of people mean when they use a word, and in fact, you know, that idea as
Yeah,
we
we have. Is that we have no idea. They're slippery. You used the word slippery to describe words in something that I read of yours recently, and I just keep circling that because that's so true. And even in plays, when we're watching them and we sort of think we're putting out one thing into the world, they're slippery out there in the audience, and we don't know how they're landing.
Well, and everyone is receiving it from where they're, where they're at in their lives, where they're coming from, their own culture, the kind of day they've had. So, again, there's also like the role the recipient of the artwork plays.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, for me, that what I love about being a painter is that I can put an intention in, I can put words in the image, and it's abstraction because it's abstract language, but it's also abstract sort of space that I'm creating. And then I'll talk to someone and they'll have a theory about what the work is about. And it has absolutely nothing to do with what I thought it was about. But I love that moment, like I just remember when I first started showing my work and all the words were backwards. And I had the idea it was like sort of Alice in Wonderland, like being behind the mirror, looking out. Also playing with the idea of what happens when you can't read words, that your brain makes sense of it in a very different way. And I remember someone coming and saying, "You've painted exactly how it feels to be dyslexic." And I thought, I'm so I'm honored by that I could capture something for you that wasn't in my scope of my intention, but that's the surprise and the real pleasure, I think, of being an artist and creating something and finding a public for it.
And having it land for someone in a way that makes sense, right? The chaos of it suddenly making sense. Well, you just mentioned sort of not being able to read words or not knowing what they mean, but having this either visual or even just emotional experience about them. And we've talked before about the fact that you were raised in Mexico. Is that right? Mexico City, Spain, France. Is it Ohio where you were
Ohio,
also?
absolutely.
Ohio.
Born in Ohio.
Born in Ohio. But, and because of that, you spoke and you currently speak many languages. And so I'm curious about how the sort of image of various languages, how that helps you or how it influences how you see words or see text or see imagery and the impact that's had on your art.
It's funny. I'm always amazed at how the brain is wired, with language and how, as a kid, for example, I remember I couldn't remember the concepts of left and right. And I always got confused coming back to English from Spanish. So I had to learn that in Spanish, the word for left is izquierda. And it's very long. And in English, the word for left is the shorter word. So, I've had all these tricks to remember how to go between languages. And very fortunate that I got to, move between countries where I spoke both languages. But I remember the first experience of moving to France as a teenager and not speaking a word of French and suddenly being sort of plopped down at age 12 in Paris and, having to figure out what things meant by sort of the signs. To watch the TV was a great way to learn a new language, listening to music, but that sense, of, the first time you get a joke in a language that's new to you. And it's such a relief, because it's like, not only have you sort of mastered a basic sentence structure, but you've also kind of clued into cultural humor. So I like watching, how a viewer, that could be me or it could be you looking at art, that how we make sense of all the clues around us, and so, obviously if you see a sign on a bathroom, you're going to learn that word. Or I always think of France, I just remember the idea of the sale, like that there was a sale in a store. You just learn things through context, and you can tell, like through graffiti, that there's a sort of anger or a big emotion behind it, and there's so much you can glean, from how things are written.
From it, have you in your art, or I'd say in the last 10 years or so, have you worked with non-English words in your paintings?
In the past, I've worked in Spanish before and translated works into Spanish and into French too. And that's fun to, take a text. I can think specifically of a project I did with Michael Joyce, where I felt that the language of certain senses needed to be in different languages. And so I also welcome that mistranslation. I remember someone was looking at a painting of mine recently, and she said, well, that's terribly translated into Spanish. And I said, well, that's part of it, that I want there to be a mistranslation, that I want that response, that I sort of didn't get the wording. Well, that's not exactly what that means, she said. And I thought that's great, but that's what I'm doing in taking words and making them into paintings. It's a mistranslation that then becomes something all of its own. And I feel that great permission. Helen Siksu and I did a project, I think it was in the video in 2013, called The Interior Forest. And we did an interview at the end of the project. We'd done it in the United States. We'd done it in France, and I'd worked with, hundreds and hundreds of people to draw her book. And she sort of turned to me in this interview and said, Alexandra, it was never a forest. I said, what? She said it was a garden. It was a walled garden. And I said, Helen, we've been working on this project for 3 years. Why didn't you tell me that I had turned your garden into a forest? And she said, well, I just loved the forest. That's part of how you made it yours, is that you made my garden, my walled garden, you turned it into a forest. And I thought that's generosity of spirit, but it's also the wonderful thing that happens when you bring a collaborator into a process.
Yeah, and translate it. I'm so glad you brought up that project, because I've been thinking about that project and the Ghost Town project, where you worked with 600 people. 600 people created a mural.
Yeah, in Guatemala City.
And I'm very moved by your work as an art activist, and I don't even know if that's the right word. I don't know if you call it art activist or community activist or advocate. But I'm really curious about how you think artists can create community right now, like community in such a Zoom-centric world that I know we'll move through it, but I don't know how much of this we'll lose. I think people are finding a comfort in it. So I'm curious, what do you think about?
It's so, when I think about those projects where I have invited in the past the public to come draw with me, and I think especially Ghost Town took place in the summertime in Guatemala City, and we were in a room with one door and a lot of fans and about 100 people drawing side by side. And when I think about that now, sort of we had water and snacks for everyone, and it was great, because we would have a gardener drawing next to an heiress, literally, and trying to connect their drawings. And we couldn't do that today with Corona. It just wouldn't be possible. So
no,
I think that idea of coming together can be done. There's a spirit of it, that could be done online through almost like a telephone game. You could honestly do a drawing, send it on. But I think there's other cumulative ways of working that many people are discovering. I found Zooms just so revelatory, actually. There's an intimacy of looking into, I get to see into your house right now. That we get to share things, and those wonderful accidents that happen with someone walking by in the past. Or I was on a Zoom and I stood up and I forgot that I had my flaming red sweatpants on. Because I just jumped up to show someone something, and it was this moment of great hilarity. So I think it's these questions of, we have new boundaries and therefore new ways to break them or break through them. And humor is such a good way. But for me, it's been such a generative time to work in the studio, I've been able to be in Berlin and to sort of get to see and different art communities than mine in Los Angeles. And so in a way, it's continuing on smaller, more intimate scale to do exchanges with the hope of bringing people together again, but in new ways. So I have new love prints that we're going to launch here in Berlin, and new ways of bringing different communities together for me now in a more international way. And that's
exciting.
Super
The
exciting. Yeah.
I know the 18th Street project pretty well, just from being raised in Los Angeles, and the sort of art access issue, for lack of a better word, is dear to my heart, around sort of making art accessible, not because everybody is necessarily an artist, but everybody deserves it, especially in a democracy where we're encouraged to express ourselves. So I think a lot about the constraints around not being able to reach our neighborhoods, and I'm thinking a lot about how do we reach neighborhoods, or how do we continue the arts access?
It's such a great question. I mean, like you, I think that art education is a civil rights issue. It's not about, an organization that I love in downtown Los Angeles. It's called the Heart of Los Angeles, and they have a youth orchestra. I mean, they do so many incredible things. And their visual arts program, when kids go to that after school, it's something around 96% of the kids graduate from high school, and then most of them go on to college, and it's immigrants to the United States, often parents who, didn't have that kind of formal education. And the goal of that arts education is not to make everyone into an artist. It's, of course, if they want to be, to encourage that, but it's to, when we're talking about people who live in the lowest quintile of, the socioeconomic strata of the United States, it's to give creativity, to give confidence, to problem solve, and to give a safe space. And when you're taught to be creative, when you're taught to think, we've been joking about sort of being an idea volcano, that can help you problem solve, not just in terms of your creativity, but in your life. How can I get from here to there? And what, the possibility of having a formal education. So I agree. I think arts education is fundamentally something every child should have access to.
Yeah, we'll keep chewing on this question of how, in this age, at least I am, about how we're gonna, keep working toward those projects when we're doing these on Zoom. All right, my brain is about to explode, because I was actually just told that we have like 5 or 6 minutes until your tour, so I gotta speed this up. So to our viewers, for those of you who are just getting to know you, so not only are you a painter and you work in sculpture and photography, but you also are a publisher. And I got to immerse myself in some of your writing this week, which kind of blew my mind. So I'm not going to ask you 20 questions about this, but I do want to put a plug to this, because if you want to know Alexandra, this is what you need to read.
I'm a little scared.
Well, it is bizarre. It's weird. It's
so bizarre.
It's Handmaid's Tale. It's Kafka. It's funny. We know these people.
Yes. You know these people, exactly.
We work in theater, and let me tell you, this is real. And again, I won't ask you 30 questions, but I'm going to invite our audiences to go to your website and find it, because you got to read this. But tell me about the works that you're drawn to, because you don't publish, Rizzoli books. But what I love about it is that for me, I think it means that you get to be an audience member. So what kind of projects are you drawn to?
Oh, thank you for saying that. One of the things that I loved doing the Hélène Cixous project in Paris is that many people came and they would just watch us do the collective drawing. And I would say, well, why don't you join us? And they would say, mais je suis un amateur. The idea of I'm an amateur, and since I'm here to appreciate, I love being an audience member. I love being a fan. I love being able to appreciate other people. It's why I've been passionate about teaching in the past. And I think publishing allows that opportunity to sort of immerse and give permission to, immerse myself and immerse our team in another person's thinking, and then to give permission to another artist to dream as big as possible what they would love to make a book about. And I think pretty much every creative person has at least one secret book that they have in their heart. And so, at Ex Artist Books, we've really developed a methodology of working with artists and creatives to help them express a vision that might not be, the most creative form of their vision. Whether it was, working with the playwright Sylvan Oswald, who had his secret book High Winds that has beautiful imagery by Jessica Fleischman, and what is that book? Is it graphic design? Is it theater? Is it LGBTQ?
Both.
It's everything. And in that story, I really loved it. It was like encouraging. Well, why not make this into a performance? You imagined it as a book, but what could it be? And then for me, so what ex-artist books are is that possibility. Yes, it's going to be something that's on a shelf, and you can have the experience of haptic in your hands and reading it, and being comforted hopefully by it, or having your curiosity piqued. But what could that book become? The first year, three of our 4 books were performed live, which I hadn't anticipated. And then we've just done Asher Hartman's work, which is a grouping of 3 plays, and again, that connection, like your first question of like the written word into the moment in space and time with people. So, it really is imagining how a book becomes space in the moment. I like going back and forth, in the same way, like I like to go back and forth between the digital and the real, that book for that, but then like the private moment to the public moment, how that works.
That is, you just described what it is to produce plays, because when we become devoted to a playwright, we don't know what's going to emerge, right? Sometimes it emerges as a movement piece. We've done pieces that have emerged as visual art pieces or as non-scripted. So this idea that they start here and who knows where they go.
Well, Sheila, welcome to Writing for Stage and Screen. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
So what are we going to be talking about this evening? What knowledge are you imparting to us?
Well, tonight we're going to be talking about the art of pitching. And this is something that I've done a bunch of times, and sometimes with success. So I'm really happy to share my knowledge about it with you guys.
Definitely with success. I think something that's interesting from our conversations is that you talked about the art of pitching as being not just about pitching material specifically, but about sort of synthesizing who we are as artists and sharing that with other people and how to articulate that to other artists. So I'm excited to hear how that's sort of incorporated into the general art of pitching.
So we're going to start with talking about what a pitch is. And people use pitch in my industry to describe several different things. But when we're using it in the sense of talking about a story that we would like to sell to people, it's basically a distilled version of that story. And it's personal. I mean, it's best when it's personal, when it's present tense, when you're telling it in the present tense, and it feels necessary to this moment. And I'll get into a little bit of the contents of what a pitch is. But I think you guys should have, I sent out, and it's really not that detailed, but it's just a little bit of an outline, which will show up in the chat, I think, a page that just says 10 things every television pitch should contain in order. And this is easy to get your hands on afterwards if you don't know how to grab it now. But I'm going to go through all of these things so that you have a sense of where this lecture is going to go, and if you want to take notes, if it's helpful to take notes as we go. But we're going to still talk a little bit for a second about what the pitch is. So sometimes in writers' rooms, people will pitch ideas, and those are also called pitches, but they're basically just people talking about their own ideas, and ideas are just shorthanded as pitches. So I have a pitch. What if it was raining on his tricycle and he had to go into the rain, and that's when he saw the clown come out of the sewer? I mean, I think I just sort of half pitched a scene from It, but that's like in the writer's room, it's like a way of colloquially chatting about ideas. But what we're talking about is more of the formal pitch. When you have an idea for a television show, or you have a take on some property and you'd like to sell it as a show. And those are the elements that we're going to talk about. So I've had some success selling original ideas and some success selling ideas that people were like, what is your take? So I'm going to be blending both of those methods into this conversation. But I guess one of the things that I wish I had known before I started working for television is what is the difference between just talking about ideas as a playwright and a formal pitch? And I would say there are two things that I didn't know that I wish I knew at the top. And then there's 10 more that we'll talk about later, 10 more things that I wish my younger self could have asked my older self before I ever opened my mouth in a room full of executives. But these are the two big differences that is worth talking about. The first thing that's different about playwriting is when you're writing a pitch, you're selling a full idea and you're selling yourself at the same time. You do all of the storytelling work up front, meaning you kind of have to know all of these elements. And as a playwright, I've never needed to know all of the elements of a play going into the writing or a workshop process. I've just needed to know kind of a feeling of the story, a feeling of the world, maybe an opening scene. And often people in theater get commissions without ever even talking about the ideas. You commission because you're the artist. But because of the nature of television, you're not just selling the ideas, you're selling your ability to execute the ideas. You're also selling your ability to continue to propagate ideas. So having a full idea of all of these elements up at the top is really going to help you convince people that you're worth paying a lot of money for at the top. So it's not just the ideas that you're selling, it's not just the story that you're selling, but you're also selling your ability to execute. The other thing that I didn't really know before I started working in this business was you have to kind of act a little bit. And to some degree, you don't have to be a good actor. But what you do have to do is make sure that when you're talking about your ideas, that you're talking about them in a way that it's clear that you're enthusiastic and that they come from a place of honesty and interest, curiosity, and that you're paying attention to what's going on in the world, and you can discuss how other people might be interested in these ideas. And there's places in the pitch, in the structure of a pitch, to talk about that. In fact, there's one primary place, which I'll talk about in a second. But so those two things, that you do most of the work up front, and it can change because you're going to have people buying your idea and they're going to have ideas too. So the pitch doesn't necessarily have to be pristine and complete from the moment you sell it to the moment it's on television. But you do have to have a larger sense of like the DNA of the show. And that pretty much won't change because that's what they're buying, and also your commitment to it. And then the acting part is at the point where you're pitching, you shouldn't feel like you're acting anymore. You should just sort of feel like this story is so exciting. You were going to write it anyway. They're lucky that they showed up to listen to you tell it. And if they want, they can buy it, but you know, you're going to make this show with or without them. And that's when people get excited about you as a storyteller in the room when you're talking about ideas. So I don't know, I'm not really going to asking questions yet, but is that clear so far? Because we're going to start to move on to the this thing. So is it everybody? I don't know how to ask this. Everybody should have this. If you don't, we'll find out somehow. So yeah, we're good? Okay, thank you.
They do have it. Yep.
Great, awesome. Thanks, Nick. I feel like I should be miming myself riding a bike while I do this, so you guys don't think that was just a shot that we staged for this in that intro, but no. Okay, so every pitch should contain these 10 things. The first thing I wrote on this list is intro. And when I say intro, I mean intro to you, intro to your world, intro to who you are, your intrinsic commitment to the material. So this is where you would discuss in a pitch your experiences and how they relate to your story. So you could choose like one illustrative or impactful anecdote from your life and describe why it's worth being made into a television show or is TV worthy. And I've done this a few times, like when I was pitching for this one TV show I might reference that I'm working on right now is a television show about a family of spies. And even though this was a book series, When I pitched to get the job, which is also something you do, it's not necessarily always your own idea. It's somebody will give you material and you'll pitch your take on it. I discussed that before, but so in this case, I pitched my take on the material. I was talking about myself as a person in a sort of a blended family growing up. And by blended, I mean, I'm just adopted. And I grew up with two siblings who were siblings who were my blood siblings. And so I told the story of what it was like to grow up in a family where the two people who are raising you don't look like you. And when there is like dissonance in a family, because maybe there's a genetic bond that people don't necessarily account for, and similarities that you don't see in people who are raising you, but you see in the people next to you. And that was my pitch, how I was able to sell my connection to this world that I was going to build. Now, that completely disappeared from the actual show that I'm writing. They're not a blended family. They're not adopted. They're literally all blood siblings. But what I think sold them on my commitment to that is I was talking about a family experience that I had lived with a large family largish family with two siblings, which this is a 3-sibling family that I'm writing about, that were messy and confused about confused when they looked at their parents about how could I have come from these people, and they bond with each other as siblings. And so like, that's just how I was connected to the material. So the intro is less about the material and more about your way into the material and why you're the absolute best person to tell the story. So if it's an original story, that's kind of already taken care of if you're talking about a story from your life. So if I was going to write a television show about 3 adopted siblings, I don't have IP for that because I am the IP for that. I'm the literal IP. When I say IP, by the way, I mean intellectual property. We'll talk about that later. So one thing I will say about the introduction part, if you're writing a television show, or if you want to pitch a television show on material that already exists, it seems contradictory to be like, well, where am I in this material? Because if you didn't write the original material, where are you? But that is exactly what people do when they make television, is they make it from themselves. Like, we're generating stories that are based on our lives, even when we're not talking about ourselves. And I think we find that in our writing, any kind of character that it's not literally our own lives. So that's always going to be the case when you're pitching, is draw them in by telling people who you are and why you're connected to the material, with enthusiasm, of course. So the log line. The log line is number 2. And the log line tends to be, let me know if I'm talking too fast, Nick, like pop up and be like, slow the frick down because you're fast.
Great pace. Great pace.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick. I love having a Nick. I wanted to show up when I'm writing and be like, great pace, great pace. And I'm like, are you sure I'm not too slow? Nick will be like, no. 3 weeks is a great amount of time to do 2 pages. My log line, your log line, our log line in our show. Basically, the log line is, how is what you're pitching the same as what's on the air? So you're basically bringing in references, not necessarily television references, but like ideas of the kind of show you're going to be writing based on formats that are out there. For example, you could say something like, my show is a darkly comic, length of the show, so a darkly comic half-hour genre blended comedy with dramatic elements for premium cable or network television or streaming services. Is it traditional? Is it non-traditional? About a blank in her blank, or about a family of blank in their blank living in blank, who is either blank or blank. And I know all those blanks are ridiculous, but you're basically just saying it's a half hour or an hour, which both exist on television right now. We have hours, we have half hours. Comedy or drama, we have both of those on the air. Or a genre blend, we have those on the air. So for example, we were talking, Nick and I were talking about Mike White's White Lotus. And in that show, I think, Nick will tell me if I'm wrong, that was a half hour? It's been a while since I watched it now. I think it's a half hour.
It's actually an hour.
An hour, genre blended I don't know, what would you call it, Nick? Would you call that a comedy or a drama?
I would call it a dramedy. I feel like there's elements of satire there that make me laugh out loud, but there are also, deeply moving moments there. So that seems to be Mike White's voice.
So we would say an hour long premium cable, because it was on HBO, drama, comedy, comic drama, or genre blended is the term I've been hearing lately, about and what would you say it was about? A person, a people, a community, a
community. Are you asking me that question?
Yeah,
Is that rhetorical? Okay, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't bogarting here.
You're not on.
I think it's about affluent people who go to a resort and they don't realize what their footprint is sort of impressing, right. and they don't realize that their luxury is sort of on the backs of a lot of people, and people are sacrificing their own livelihoods in order for them to sort of experience this luxury and this week of fabulousness.
Right. So we would, if we were pitching that, we would distill that to basically a group of people a group of wealthy, or a group of privileged people, of privileged white people who show up to an island and are in for a treat, or don't realize what they're in for, or get more than they bargained for. And that's something I think that's pretty standard from a lot of things on television. So we would get into more of what you're talking about, the footprint, the thematic stuff that would come a little later. But this is basically the barest minimum you can say about the raw material, the literal format of the show, like the who, the what, the where, and the where does it belong on the landscape of television world. Perfect. So I think that's pretty clear. Now, when that's the log line, when we talk about tone, that's when we talk about how it's different from other things. And this is number 3. That's when we talk about how it's different than things on the air by literally referencing other television shows. So, I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but it's like, it's the Flintstones on the Hamptons with, spin bikes. I have no idea. I don't know what the hell show that is or why anybody would watch it, but I could sell it if I tried really hard. Maybe, I don't know. But I would not, obviously I would then go back and I would pitch my intrinsic commitment, which is I'm a spin instructor and I'm really excited. But also then I would talk about how, why like cavemen are interesting to me, et cetera, et cetera. I would get down to the tone. When I got to the tone, it's blank meets blank, but it's different than you think because of blank. That sounds crazy, but the hilarious unexpected twist is often where you start to differentiate the two things you've just described. So that's the tone. And I can throw some stuff at you real quick if you want to just write this stuff down. Sometimes it's easier to have a shorthand. Modern examples are always better unless it's an iconic show. So The Sopranos is pretty much always relevant because it sort of established a certain kind of television show that we'd never had before on premium cable. The hilarious twist is, of course, he's got a conscience. A brutal murderer and his family, and he's got a conscience and he's going to therapy. And it turns out that's not what the show became, because it became so much more than that. It became more about the family. But let's see, when you're talking about the tone, references you can use are pacing, the kind of humor, the look and feel, a darkly comic whatever. You can talk about if it's gritty, if it's lighthearted. You could talk about if there's magical realism, if it's a funny noir, if it's frankly sexual, whatever is going to help communicate in the shortest possible language, the smallest possible words, the fewest possible words, what the show is. And those 3 things, and I'll say them again, the intro, which is about you, the log line, which is about how the show is similar to things on the air that we know, and the tone, how things are, and that's when you reference like things that are already out there and crush them together, and then talk about how your show is different than those. Those 3 things are what is going to actually hook the people into the premise. Okay, so those represent the premise of the show pretty much in as small terms as possible. That should not take more than 3 minutes to talk about, and I know that I took a lot more than that to talk about. And those should be pretty small. I think probably where you're going to spend your most time talking is when you do the teaser, because it's going to be probably the thing that you've actually written out in your head, that you have or written out on a paper or put the most material down on. And we'll get there. It's not until number 5. But the next 3, the next one thing, no, not 3, one thing, 4. So we're at 4 now, is themes. This one you can blow by pretty quick because the themes are going to come out more in the writing. And the themes are basically your opinion, your point of view. Like what's your take on this material? What are you saying? What is the show about? And it's really annoying when you've gone through a pitch and then you have and this happened to me several times, and they understand like the premise of the show and they understand the world, they understand like, all the elements of the pitch, but then they say, but what is it about? And so that's why I put it up at number 4. It's something you should probably know how to answer before they have to ask you. And so the way to think about this, I think, when you're conceiving about the story that you eventually want to write and put on the air, is think about it like, what are the opposites in my show? Where does the tension lie in the material? So this is where you would sort of quickly hit all the probing and penetrative questions the series is going to ask, like, is she mentally ill or is she full of magic? Or is he a murderer or is he a messiah? And the answer is maybe yes to both of those questions. He's both, she's both. This is a show about identity / family / mortality / denial. We're talking about concepts here. This is the thin line between blank and blank. So these are just buzzy words that will get you to talk about your theme. This show will explore the cultural consciousness of blank while affirming the idea of blank. And this is what Nick nailed earlier on when he was talking about the footprints of the people who land on the island and don't realize what they're crushing. This is when you'll talk about like race, politics, cultural resonance, class struggles, gender, all of that goes in the theme. So this is basically this number 4 here is when you pull out of the show and you see what the bigger resonance of the show is in the world and at this time. Those top 4 things you should probably get through in about 5 to 10 minutes, and depending on who you're pitching to and if they're familiar with the material.
Good afternoon and welcome to Living Room Local. I'm your guest moderator today, Mashonda Lindsay. And of course, we want to welcome you, Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Thank you, Mashonda. It's a pleasure to be here, wherever here is. Are you in Boulder?
I am actually in Aurora, on the Denver-Aurora line in Colorado. So local theater has its roots in many parts of the Colorado area. Yeah,
Colorado's got a very interesting history with Black people, and it's not generally known, but Black pioneers went there, and homesteaders, and yes. Even people who like to ski who were Black.
Absolutely, breaking many myths here. Well, we're delighted to have you. It's such a thrill. I am guest because of an amazing opportunity because of my husband being a local theater company member, Cajardo Lindsay. And so that gives me this opportunity to be a guest host here today. And we're also the parents of 2 college sons. So I hope Seven and Seth, you're watching and taking notes. And speaking of college, as Harvard professor, I want to let everyone know this connection between you and local theater, that many moons ago, you were the professor of our local theater co-founder, Megan Matthews. And so years later, because of your influence, undoubtedly, she and the other co-founder, Pesha Rudnick, created local theater with the mission of expanding the canon of American stories and playwrights.
Well, she was a brilliant student. And the only reason I'm doing this on Sunday afternoon is because of my affection for and loyalty to Megan. Yesterday, we filmed Brittany Packnett Cunningham, the co-founder of Campaign Zero, after Michael Brown. We did her family tree in New York. So we drove all the way home. We got home about 10:30 last night and crashed. And I said, well, I have to do this. So I watched Otis Moss III at Trinity Church in Chicago. I try to watch him every Sunday.
Yes.
And that was let all that gospel music wake me up.
Well, I'm going to jump to basically something that I read about you in terms of when you grew up. Like many African Americans, because of cultural brainwashing, there was this distancing of wanting to see our connection to Africa, but then developing into a love affair with Africa to
Right.
wanting to highlight this common connection we all have to mitochondrial Eve and to this common birthplace. So how does that inform your programming on finding your roots?
Well, when I was growing up, Africa was not a romantic place generally in the cultural imaginary of African Americans. I went to a white school. I was born in 1950, Brown v. Boards in 1954. I am from Piedmont, West Virginia. Now, Piedmont, West Virginia is halfway between Pittsburgh and Washington. I know you people out there around Denver, not so good on the geography in the east. But it's in the Allegheny Mountains on the Potomac River. And it was an Irish-Italian paper mill town with 2,500 people and just over 300 Black people the year that I was born, according to the 1950 census. And you would think West Virginia, and with the stereotypes about West Virginia, that maybe it would have been slow to integrate because integration was county by county. But in my county, for reasons that I'll never understand, the people there voted, and they voted to integrate in 1955, and I started first grade in 1956.
Wow.
So I started 12 years at the white school.
Yeah.
And I never, ever experienced any kind of discrimination from a teacher in the classroom. It's not like Richard Wright, who writes about, a teacher telling him, lawyer, you can't be a lawyer. You need to be a carpenter or a bricklayer. Nothing wrong with being a carpenter or bricklayer. I've always been blessed in the classroom. I always got straight A's, and I was the number one. Though if you ask Brenda Kimmel, she would say she was number one. She was my rival. We're best friends to this day. But despite the fact that it integrated in 1955, and despite the fact that I never suffered discrimination, the school system, like all school systems in America at that time, was not big on what today we call Black history or African American history.
Right.
We used to call it Negro Day. And basically, everything you ever learned about Black people, you learned in 1 hour. And it started with the fact that the best thing that ever happened to Africans was being taken into slavery and shipped over across the ocean to be civilized and Christianized by white Americans in North America. There was no culture, no history in Africa. Our ancestors running around naked, swinging through trees, worshiping fetishes. It was cold. And then they would get to Abraham Lincoln and say, I remember Mr. Baker, my 8th grade civics teacher, looked at the 3 Black guys. We were all seated together in the front row. And he said, you boys, without Abraham Lincoln, you boys wouldn't even be here today. And Miss Shonda, we dug down in our chairs, and it was bad. But a funny thing happened to me in 1960.
Okay.
And 1960 was a year of African independence. 19 African nations became independent. And for reasons that I will never understand, I became charmed, enamored by these names. Kwame Nkrumah. Ghana became independent in 57. Julius Nyerere, Joshua Nkomo, Nelson Mandela, And so Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. And so I memorized their names, at least as they were spoken by Walter Cronkite, on CBS News. And I memorized the names of the countries and their capitals. And then, you're probably too young for this, but we used to get Reader's Digest condensed books.
I remember those, yes.
That was, we had the World Book, and then we had Reader's Digest condensed books. And I remember, and then we would get Reader's Digest. And my father loved, he got Alfred Hitchcock's mystery magazine, detective magazine, and because he loved mysteries and detective stories. So in Reader's Digest, I read a story about this African boy who basically walked across the equator and was saved by some missionaries, and he ended up, I think, in Seattle or something like that. And that stuck with me on that for so long. So I go to Yale. I went to Piedmont High School. I graduated, and I went to Potomac State College, to junior college, a branch of West Virginia University my freshman year, and then I transferred to Yale. And I did very well at Yale. And at the end of my sophomore year, I applied for a program called 5-year BA. It was funded by the Carnegie Corporation. And I was selected. And I went to Tanzania. And I went there because the Gates family were Episcopalians. And in the Anglican Communion, every diocese in America has a sister diocese in the developed world. It's probably true all over the West, right? And it just so happens that the Diocese of West Virginia, sister diocese, was what was then called the Diocese of Central Tanganyika. And so they got me a job. I was pre-med because, like all smart little Black boys and girls when I was growing up, you know, I was raised to be a doctor. My mother, God rest her soul, she probably still hasn't forgiven me for not becoming a medical doctor. My brother is an oral surgeon, and he's 5 years older than I am. So he kind of checked that box for me. But I took science courses at Yale, and then when I went to graduate school in Cambridge, because I was, you know, it was imprinted on me to be a doctor. So I got a job in a mission hospital, Anglican mission hospital, in the bush. I mean, in the center of Tanzania, 4 hours by Land Rover from the capital city, Dodoma. 120 beds for 50,000 people. No running water, no electricity. You know, I lived with the European missionaries. There were about half a dozen of them. I had a big afro. And when they, you know, I was Captain Black Man, you know, and I got there and I was telling them about Black Power. These missionaries like freaked out. But let me tell you what happened to that afro. It was about 100 degrees. And, you know, that afro, after about 3 days, that afro bit the dust, man. I cut that afro off. I go, we have that afro when I get back to New Haven because there's no way to take care of it. But I learned a little Swahili, and I learned a lot about, I lived with the Gogo people. In Swahili, a singular is the Ngogo, plural is the Wagogo, and you live in Ugogo and you speak Kigogo. But the lingua franca was Swahili. So Unasema ki Swahili mama. And I learned how to say all kind of medical terms like wehele, that means breathe deeply. And then because it was a mission, these were Anglican missionaries, but they were serious about church. I had to go to chapel every day before we went to into the hospital. So my vocabulary has words like umtakatifu, umtakatifu, umtakatifu. And that, I'd give you $1 million if you guess what that means.
I have no idea what that means.
Holy, holy, holy. So then, after I couldn't stand it anymore, because the missionaries and I fought, I thought that they were racist and that they were, well, let me put it this way, that they had unfortunate implicit biases. That's the more polite way to put it.
Yes.
And they were there, like checking the box so they could get into heaven. They did a lot of good, don't get me wrong. But they did not really value traditional African ways of life. They never had any of the African nurses around for social events and like dinner until I came and I got on them about stuff like that. So finally, after fighting with them about these attitudes, I arrived there in August, and then I left in December, and I went into Dar es Salaam. And there's a point to this story, so just bear with me. It's almost finished. And I always wanted to go to Zanzibar, which at the time was part of Tanzania. They were one country. And Zanzibar was exotic with cloves and spices and the slave trade. And, you know, it's very Arabic in its culture. And so you would basically go down to the dock and hitch a ride on a fishing boat. The fishing boats are called dhows, D-H-O-W, in Swahili. And you'd pay a few shillings, and there were 7 shillings to a dollar, and they would let you ride. And I met this white guy who just graduated from Harvard and just got kicked out of what's now Namibia. He thought he was going to go to it was then called Southwest Africa. It was fighting for freedom. He thought this white boy from Harvard was going to go not be noticed by the South African secret police. He lasted about 5 minutes. They kicked him out. He ended up in Tanzania, which had provided a home for all the freedom fighters, people fighting against the Portuguese for their independence, against the apartheid regime in South Africa, Rhodesia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So halfway across the Indian Ocean, he told me that his fantasy was to go from the Cape to Cairo, like Cecil Rhodes wanted to build a railroad from Cape to Cairo. My fantasy, because of that boy about whom I read in Reader's Digest, was to cross the equator. I flipped a coin, I won, and he and I hitchhiked across the equator. We took 2 months, and we went from Dar to Kinshasa, went through pygmy villages, and we sailed all the way down the Congo River. That's what I learned, that Black people could swim, because all these villages along the river, like everybody could swim, you know. And I was thinking, man, I wish the racists could have see these photographs I'm taking, because all these people can swim. And I'm trying to be funny, of course. And then I flew to Nigeria from Kinshasa, and then I flew to Accra, because the point of it was a pilgrimage going to the grave of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was my hero. And he renounced his American citizenship in 1961, moved to Ghana, where he became the editor of the Encyclopedia Africana, and he died in Ghana the night before Martin Luther King's March on Washington and I Have a Dream speech. And I made a pilgrimage to his grave, and I have a photograph. They've since moved his grave to a mausoleum, but I have a photograph that I took with my little Nickermat camera of that grave. And then I think by this time it was about April, and I flew back to Europe. But it was a trip that changed my life, because in those days, air miles were what the way we think of them today. Air mileage was the distance as the crow flies between, say, JFK and Dar es Salaam Airport. And there were 11,000 air miles. So, and I was terrified of flying. I'd only been on an airplane one time. And so I said, well, I'm going to go for it. I had $500 for the year. I had a backpack, a pair of sandals, a couple pairs of underwear, and I took 3 books with me: Don Quixote, Moby Dick, and John Hope Franklin's From Slavery to Freedom. And I got on that plane at JFK, praying all the time. I prayed myself across the Atlantic, and I flew from New York to London, to Amsterdam, to Paris, to Rome, to Athens, to Tel Aviv, to Addis Ababa, to Nairobi, and then Dar es Salaam over a 2-month period. So by the time I turned 20 in that village, I had seen Europe and the Middle East. I'd climbed the Parthenon. It was like a fantasy trip, all because I read a story when I was 10 years old about an African boy who walked across the equator.
That is impressive. And I wish I had a map to be able to pinpoint all of the places that you went, because it's so incredible. You mentioned W.E. Du Bois, and I know that from a speech that you gave back in January of 2004, you talk about how he made this assessment of the 20th century, saying that the biggest problem would be the color line. Mm-hmm. And so here we are, still in the beginning parts of the 21st century. We've wrapped up 2020. We're in the beginning of 2021. What are you seeing as a problem that we're still dealing with, and perhaps even the solution or hope that you have in the midst of where we are today?
You're absolutely right. The most famous line of many that Dr. Du Bois wrote, and for those who don't know, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, who was the most arrogant Black man who ever walked on the face of the earth, and probably the smartest, the first Black person to get a PhD in the history of Harvard in 1895. And he wrote a classic book that I'll be teaching in 3 weeks called The Souls of Black Folk. And I encourage you all to read. I've done a Norton critical edition of that book, and I'll be doing a new edition of it. But I love this book. And he's in it, he says, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And it's the most quoted sentence, excuse me, from that book. And he was a visionary. I mean, we don't remember, but World War I, many of the major battles of World War I were fought in East Africa. And they were fought over the colonies because there was tremendous wealth. In that little village called Kilimatindi, where I lived, there was a German graveyard of German soldiers who had died in World War I because battles were fought in Tanganyika, and because there were tremendous resources all throughout Africa, and these Europeans had sent in Berlin in 1884 and just carved it up like a piece of pie and just gave it to each other. No human beings lived there. I would say, as we face the 21st century, the problem of the 21st century is the problem of the color line as it reflects economic inequality.
Okay.
Race and economics are inextricably intertwined. And so is religion. I tell my students, and Megan no doubt heard me say this, that under the floorboards of Western civilization, there are two streams running,
Yes.
even as we speak. And one is anti-Black racism, and one is anti-Semitism. There are pogroms that go back to the 14th century, and probably before. And we know that, you know, even during Reconstruction, and one of my favorite films in my oeuvre was my Reconstruction film, when the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, 13th is passed and ratified in December 1865. 14th, which established birthright citizenship and gave Black men in the South the right to vote, Equal Protection Clause. And then the 15th, which gave all Black men the right to vote. When they were being passed, and then 16 Black men were elected to Congress between 1870 and 1877, there were 8 major massacres of Black people throughout the South. And I'm citing that to say, coterminous with Black progress has always been a backlash. And that backlash, to me, ultimately, though it's justified in terms of racist stereotypes, demeaning images and beliefs about the nature of our people, really the cause is economic scarcity, the threat of inequality. You know, it's easy to be liberal if you have enough money in the bank, right? But if you're unemployed, if you think that the arc of economic progress, which was basically part of the fairy tale of American situation comedies that we were raised on in the 50s, you know, Leave It to Beaver, something you were too young to know. But, you know, I wanted to grow up and have a house like Beaver Cleaver, you know, and live in that kind of suburban neighborhood. And his father wore a shirt and tie to dinner, and the mother was always dressed. I thought, wow, man, that's the way it's supposed to be. We were raised to think that if you were a good person, you obeyed the laws, you worked hard, you went to church, then even if you, like my father worked in the paper mill with all these other Italian and Irish descended people, your kids would go to college. And then they would become doctors or lawyers or whatever, or teachers, and their kids would go to college. And they would move back home, and you'd buy your house, and you'd have 2 cars and 2 color TVs. Well, that inevitable arc of upward mobility ended. And so someone had to be blamed, just like Jewish people were blamed all throughout European history in times of economic scarcity, which culminated, of course, the most dramatical, horrendous example is the Holocaust. And we can see that with Black America. In the history of Black people, the relationship between race and economics is inscribed in the term slave or enslaved person. A slave is a racialized economic being. Though civilization itself is coterminous with slavery, slavery is coterminous with civilization. The word slave itself etymologically comes from Slav. So there, everybody had slaves. And we know the Jewish people were enslaved by the Pharaoh. But the transatlantic slave trade was the greatest mass enforced migration of human beings in history. 12.5 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean between 1501 and 1866. About 50% died, so 10.8 million arrived in the New World. Guess how, okay, so hold that thought, 10.8 million. How many do you think came to what's now the United States of that 10.8 million who survived the Middle Passage? Take a wild guess. There are no wrong answers in our class.
Okay, we're going to say a quarter.
Okay, a quarter, so that would be 2.5 million, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if you have a chat room, right?
I do have a chat room, but I can't see all of their answers just yet, so we have to wait. I know you want to click them.
We're going to wait. We're going to wait.
Okay.
We're going to let them, you tell me when a minute's up. You can ask me something else, and then I'll tell you the answer. I want everybody to.
Everyone needs to guess. I guessed a quarter. Some people may guess a half. How many want to guess 75%? So let's hear.
Okay, you ready?
Okay.
388,000.
Wow.
Only 388,000 Africans came from Africa to North America. Another 42,000 came in the intra-American slave trade. So that's 440,000. All the rest went to places south of Key West. 1 million went to the country that's now Haiti. 1 million went to, I'm sorry. 770,000 went to the country that's now Haiti. 950,000 went to Cuba. 1 million went to Jamaica. You ready for this? 5 million went to Brazil. 5 million. And the reason they had such higher numbers was two reasons. One, the slave trade ended in the United States on January 1st, 1808. So you couldn't import any more Africans. And secondly, because sugar was the world's first, universal commodity crop. Before the New World opened up with big sugar plantations, only rich people like kings and queens, and bishops too, as the song says, could afford sugar. It was very expensive. But once the New World opened up, sugar became a mass-consumed commodity. England built a culture around having caffeine and sugar at tea time, 4 o'clock, right? And along with sweets.
Well, we all need to take your class because we have 20 people guessed more than 75%.
Yeah, there you go. And guess what the average lifespan of an enslaved person was on a sugar plantation? Guess how many years?
It can't be much. That's brutal work.
Brutal.
I would say 38.
7. 7 years was the average lifespan of a male working on a sugar plantation. So they would just work them to death and replace them. And over 5 million came from Congo, Angola, to Brazil, and to other places. You know, when we think of it, I'm sitting in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so you kind of think that Brazil is somehow straight down south below us, right? But it's not. It's halfway over to Africa. So that if you look at it on a real map, Brazil is very close to Africa. And because of the currents and the winds, in fact, if you wanted to sail from Congo or Angola to Portugal, it was faster to sail to Brazil and then sail to Portugal than to sail up the coast. Okay. So there was a massive slave trade out of Congo and Angola. And so, and we now know because of something called the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database,
yes,
we know that 25% of our African ancestors, for those of us who are Americans, came from Senegambia, and another 25% came from Congo, Angola. About 18% came from Eastern Nigeria, Igbo. So we now know that because of this great database. And you could Google it while you're sitting there watching. It's called the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. And Dr. David Eltis and David Richardson assembled all these scholars, and they looked at 36,000 shipping records of slave voyages, and they counted the enslaved Africans put on these ships. So we know where the ports that they were shipped out of, and we know where they landed. Half of our ancestors arrived, 48%, through Charleston, South Carolina. It's incredible. Charleston is like our Ellis Island. So that's the complex history of the relationship between race and class. And America's never gotten over it. That inscribed relationship between race and economics. Affirmative action, which enabled me and my generation to go to Yale. I show up at Yale in September '69. I'm one of 96 Black kids. The class of '66 at Yale had 6 Black men to graduate. My class had 96. You know who's in my class? Sheila Jackson Lee, Congresswoman from Houston. She had Barbara Jordan's seat. Kurt Schmoke, the first Black mayor of Baltimore. He was a Rhodes Scholar 2 years before I became a Mellon Fellow to go to University of Cambridge. He inspired me to want to go to graduate school in England. There was a little nerdy pre-med kid. I always forget his name, who was in our class. Let me see. Oh, yeah, Ben Carson. Ben Carson and his wife Candy was in the class behind us. We were the biggest class of Black kids ever let into Yale in history because of affirmative action, which was the system's attempt in response to all of the protests following Dr. King's assassination to respond. It was like a pressure cooker, letting off some pressure. And so they integrated elite institutions like Harvard or Yale or, Boulder or University of Colorado, whatever it was. They let more Black people in. And what it did primarily, though, was expand the size of the Black middle class, the upper middle class. Affirmative action at the beginning was a class escalator. And now it's become a class perpetuator. So that I am teaching at Harvard the children of the Black middle class, the Black upper middle class, rather than teaching people who were first generation college or from the working class or, the lower socioeconomic classes.
So, John, I want to do a little snooping for our guest, or for your guest. What is among your favorite items in the room that you're sitting in?
Oh, how nice of you to ask, Lisa. Well, this is just our very comfortable family room. This is where we sit and watch television, and there's a lovely painting in the background, which is painted by my daughter Phoebe's partner, Nathan Redwood, who's a magnificent painter. And those are 2 blue ducks. I can't explain them at all, except that they were my wife's, Mary's, inspiration in an antique shop.
Lovely, lovely.
I wish I had a nice fire crackling, but I'm in Los Angeles where there
right
are
now you don't need that.
Fires that are crackling are very unwelcome ones.
Indeed, indeed. So I think that being in your home for this gathering is kind of poignant because my sense is that you really gained traction on this manuscript because of the sheltering at home that we had to do for COVID-19. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. And, I know that the point of the poems is very different, but you pulled that little Shakespeare thing. Everybody was always like, oh, who's super productive during COVID? You have been super productive during COVID. However, I don't think the title of this poem is about that. It is called Pandemic is a Terrible Thing to Waste. And I'd love to have you tell us a little bit about it and read it if you would.
Good, I will read it. You're right, Lisa. This was my sheltering in place project. I said yes to this book in December with great trepidation because I had 5 months of very hard work ahead of me. I was working on a TV series with Jeff Bridges in Los Angeles. And I thought, it was just simply too important to try to get this book out before the election. So I said yes and braced myself. And I was afraid I would never make my deadline. It was like mid-April. Along came the coronavirus. And I'm one of those lucky people who had an obsessive project to occupy myself,
Absolutely.
distract myself from the horrors all around me, and to address them in a completely oblique and fun way. Doggerel poetry. This, by the way, is a follow-up to another book I wrote under very different circumstances last year. But it covers, first of all, impeachment, second, the coronavirus, and third, the arrival of Black Lives Matter activism in the streets. So it was an astonishingly eventful 6 months of my life, and I had the great privilege. It was almost a gift to me. I was asked to address this in comic verse.
The two of us had spoken about rhyme and its stickiness and its ability to sort of stir memories. And I think that there's the news cycle, which means that people go very quickly and we forget them very fast because there's a new group of people that have piled on. But your verse kind of brings them back in a way, stirs them up, and some of them are still around and some of them have been cashiered because that's how vulnerable it is to be in the Trump administration or near the Trump administration. So I think that rah, rah, rah gets at this a little bit, that like sort of sense of like, team loyalty and how fragile it may be nonetheless. I wonder if you would read that.
Yes, rah, rah, rah. I love your word stickiness. I think you're the first person I've ever heard use that, and I know exactly what you mean. Somehow or other, you reach the end of a line in perfect meter, and you make a perfect rhyme that is the last word you expected. And somehow or other, even though it's news that you've heard and reported 100 times, that is the description of that moment that sticks with you.
I recently saw kind of your satireography in a way, and there was a sort of rather marked break in it. You've returned with a fire to it, but there was this break that between I don't know, maybe 1999 and 2011, or maybe even earlier, 1988 and 2011. And I was like going, well, I wonder what happened at that time. It's like, it couldn't have been Cliffhanger or Pelican Brief or A Civil Action or, playing Dr. Dick Stockton. It couldn't be that. It couldn't be Dexter's Arthur Miller. I mean, you were a very busy guy. So could you share a little bit of your history, your pre-history, and then this like sort of uptick in your relationship to satire?
Well, it's been an interesting career. In a lot of ways, it's broken down into 3 acts. If it was a play, it would be a 3-act play. Nice. The first act was the 1970s in New York, when I was almost completely a New York theater actor. I was in 12 Broadway shows. I've been in 25 of them so far, but all through the 70s, I was virtually performing on Broadway every night. And my big break was a Tony-winning debut in 1973 of a new play called The Changing Room. Then along came the 80s, when I relocated to Los Angeles for love, not ambition. My wife is a UCLA professor. I moved out there, and instead of being a theater actor who sometimes does movies, I became a movie actor who sometimes still does theater. Wow. That's when I did Terms of Endearment and Footloose and the Twilight Zone movie and The World According to Garp and Buckaroo Banzai and Harry and the Hendersons. Just a whole tumble of extremely different movie jobs. And then I returned to New York in the late 80s to do M. Butterfly on Broadway. I'm always returning. Something always brings me back. But that was a long period away from New York theater. Mm-hmm. And then in the early 90s, I was approached to star in an absolutely ridiculous television series called Third Rock from the Sun. And that was an entirely new act in my life and the most fun I have ever had. We went for 6 years. I was just in an incredible ensemble of comic actors. In many ways, it was more theater than film, really, performing for a studio audience once a week. And then ever since then, having done 3 chapters of very, very different work, I get called on to do all sorts of things, everything from very serious stuff, like Love is Strange, a wonderful film, to horror stuff like Dexter, and completely loopy comedy. Because of Third Rock from the Sun, I'm still in that game, like Daddy's Home too. Satire, intermittently, I have dipped into that.
Mhm.
I did satirical radio on WBAI in
Wow.
New York when I started out. I've done Saturday Night Live, hosted it 3 times in the 80s, but I've never been an entirely, I haven't been a political activist. Somehow or other, the Trump era has sort of dragged me into the public arena. Satire, I have been rhyming doggerel all this time for various purposes, most notably for 9 children's picture books, which are entirely written in rhyming verse, almost Dr. Seussian verse.
Mhm.
This came along just out of the blue. It was a bright idea by my literary agent after I had performed a parody of Gilbert and Sullivan in a New York Public Theater gala in which I rewrote the lyrics to suit Michael T. Flynn. I performed it in the character of Michael T. Flynn shortly after his egregious scandal and firing. I sang, instead of "I am the very model of a modern major general," I sang, "I am the very model of an ex-lieutenant general," and made a big success with that. And I don't know, it was suddenly my agent, David Kuhn, he made the connection between that and the possibility of an entire book of poems. And that book was Dumpty Verses for the Age of Trump in Verse, it was called. And this book is merely the sequel to that, with more events coming tumbling at us.
At quite a ridiculous pace, it seems. So one of the things, so rhyme, because of the children's books, but also I remember I kind of squirreled away a story about Tartuffe and college that you had mentioned to me because I wanted to hear it. And because we were talking about the power of rhyme, and it's like you have this history with satire, but certainly you have an even longer history with rhyme. I wondered if you had the inclination to perhaps share it with us.
Yes. Yeah, I played Tartuffe as a senior in college in the translation by the brilliant Richard Wilbur, who's one of the great rhyming poets. I mean, not just noted for his rhyme, but his rhyme and his meter is unbelievable. And he managed to capture the rhythms and the music of Molière better than anybody in English. And yes, you're right. After all these years, those rhymes are so indelible that they have stuck in my mind. And when we were on the phone, I was tempted to just rattle off. Tartuffe speaking to Elmire and trying to seduce her. He declares a love of heavenly beauty must not preclude a proper love for earthly pulchritude. Our senses are quite rightly captivated by perfect works. Our Maker has created, some glory clings to all that heaven has made. In you, all heaven's marvels are displayed. How can I look on you, O flawless creature, and not adore the author of all nature, feeling a love both passionate and pure for you, his triumph of self-portraiture? Now, that's miraculous rhyme writing. And you see how it sticks in your mind?
Yeah.
That's stickiness. That's what you call stickiness.
That is sticky. Yes, it is indeed, but in such a good way. Not like it's funny that you had mentioned, I wanted to go back to just a little bit because I know that you sort of had I remember in a New York Times op-ed piece for Dumpty that you began by saying something along the lines of, and in fact, I think I'll read it because you write so beautifully, I shouldn't make up stuff. Readers of this page have every reason to be suspicious of the political musings of an actor. I'm suspicious of them myself. And I thought that was so interesting because I do think that's something I'm very curious about. Like, was it a particular moment, a final straw, or did you just have the cumulative effect of all that stable genius that like brought you into this fray?
I think final straw is the word for it. Besides which, sort of being invited to express myself.
Absolutely.
I was quite intimidated by the challenge of writing a New York Times editorial, but I wasn't going to say no. And
Right.
in my experience, the things that you're most afraid of are the things that you should really do,
Oh, that's great advice.
and often result in the best things you've done. I don't know that I can say that about my editorial, but it was a meditation on Trump as an entertainer,
Right.
written by a professional entertainer. And my judgment was that he was an awful entertainer. A man who's so completely unself-aware, has no sense of irony, really has a complete absence of sense of humor. You never actually hear him tell a joke.
Or laugh.
So I almost dismissed him as a lousy entertainer. In a sense, I was wrong, because in fact, Donald Trump gets bigger crowds than I will ever get, gets bigger responses to his sort of cloddish sense of humor. But I mean, that's the harsh truth. All of us performers are preaching to the choir. You're only there if you want to see that person perform.
Right.
And Trump's crowd is there for him.
So the topic of my sort of series of conversations is writing for time and place. And I think that is it's a lot of what I tend to do in my work. And so I thought that the best way for me to share with you what I know is to talk about process. You saw the work that I've made in the past, but I'm working on a few projects right now, and I'll sort of give you like the array of topics and times and places that I'm contending with. So I'm working on a play about 18th century paleontologist George Cuvier. I'm working on a musical about 4 mixed race Chinese, Polish, American singers from the 1930s and 40s called the Kim Lu Sisters. I'm working on a mystery set in the Northwoods of Minnesota in the present, in the time of COVID. I'm working on a play about the invention of the birth control pill in the 1950s. And I'm working on a play about the future where people have colonized the moon, and in the way that people have colonized other countries in the world we live on now. So I share all of that with you so that you have a sense of the span of topics that I or any of us can write about. And I think that there's one thing that all of those projects have in common, and that is that they are a way for me to talk about today and to talk about the themes and the issues that I feel passionately about. Before I was a playwright, I was a journalist. And I think it's that sensibility that I bring to my work. Each play for me is a process of discovery. I think a lot of writers will say that, but hopefully each play is a process of discovery, not only of the play itself, but also of the world and on behalf of the community at large. So research obviously plays a huge role in that, as does received communication, or being a conduit for the voices that float around me, around us. For me, sometimes that is the voices or the stories of my ancestors, who I tend to do a lot of research and commune with as much as I can. And sometimes that has to do with environment or current events or what have you. And for me, a play will begin sometimes with those voices, sometimes with a theme. Of the plays that I mentioned to you, the play about the paleontologist is a a play that I want to write about mass extinction. He was the first person to prove the theory of extinction, while at the same time fighting against the idea of evolution. And so for me, I wanted to talk about extinction and also talk about what it means to be both right and wrong at the same time in such a strong way. And sometimes my plays begin just with a time and a place. So the play about the North Woods of Minnesota, for example, it's a play for audible, and so it has to be an oral experience. And one of the places that I've been in my life that feels like the most sensory are the North Woods of Minnesota, the Boundary Waters, those big skies and lakes and beautiful trees. So those are the seeds of where a play can begin. And sometimes those ideas, those initial ideas, can expand into the thing I call theme, this idea of extinction maybe, or with the story about the mixed race performers from the 1930s and 40s. It's really about what it's like to be an Asian American in the entertainment business. The next thing that I was going to chat with you all about is this idea of time and place. How do we choose the right time and place for our play? What is the content that we're trying to express through time and through place? As we know, anytime a play happens, it's in some kind of setting. I'm sorry I'm being so theatrically biased. A screenplay, an audio play, TV show, etc. We know that they're all set in some sort of environment. And for me, one of the first things that I do is find the environment. It's very hard for me to understand the story I'm telling without knowing what its context is. So what makes a good environment? For me, it's interesting. It contains unique characters who speak in a specific way. It provides an opportunity to talk about the future or shine a light on the past. And most importantly, it's a way to process the present time that we're living in. I thought I would share a bit about my play, The Paper Dreams of Harry Chin, which is about a specific time and several specific places. But as a way to talk about why pick that topic and why pick those places and times. This is a play that was commissioned by the History Theater in 2014, and it's a play about the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Chinese Exclusion era and the way that period of history impacted one family. So in 2014, it was we were under a different president, and still there was a lot of alarming to me rhetoric swirling around about immigration. And the Chinese exclusion era is a time period that I knew only after I stopped studying anything in school. I didn't learn about it in college or in high school or any other time in my school life. And that felt alarming to me, that there was this, if you don't know, this 60 plus year history where Chinese people were excluded by name, were not allowed to immigrate to the US. And it only ended in 1943, and even then it switched over to a quota system, and so Chinese people were effectively excluded until the 60s. It's a huge part of my history, not my personal history, but the history of the community that I belong to, and still wasn't talked about. And it felt like the way that that immigration politics were moving forward at this time and continue to do so, it felt like we were on the brink of starting to make the same mistake again as a country. So it felt like a very appropriate time to revisit. And so the History Theater and I were hoping to work on a project together. And so I thought maybe this is the right project for that collaboration. Their mission is to tell stories, true stories about Minnesota and the Midwest. And so I was certain that there was a story that came out of the Chinese exclusion era, this 60 plus year period in history that would have some interaction with the Midwest. So I started to do some research. Sometimes research is collecting facts or digging into the information that we need in order to portray a story with accuracy and with compassion. But sometimes research is just about surfing and collecting ideas and digging into our own subconscious, drawing connections between things. And all of this is sort of circling around the idea of theme for me. What is this about? Where does the seed of this project come from? For me, finding this theme, this flavor is key. It's finding connection to other people. It's finding the thing about this project that draws an audience to it, that helps the script, the story build community around itself. That is what the theme is. And I'll say over the next 3 weeks, we'll talk about other elements of time and place, writing for time and place. We'll talk about concept and character and story, and use time and place to dig into it. You can, as you gather your images, you can print them out. I'll share with you. You'll see my very messy office right now, but I told you I'm working on this project about the North Woods, and I just want to show you my wall of images. This is what I've got so far. Characters, place, setting, sky. So you can create a wall if you'd like. I sometimes use these images as my computer background, or if I'm really having a hard time, I often need for a character, I need to find a person. And so sometimes I'll put that as my phone background, so I see it every time I go to text. But basically I build for myself an environment within which I can dive into this work. And I'll say, if you discover anything concrete as you're scratching, collecting, journaling about it, then just move it gently into your planning document, and start to see if there is a before and an after. Start to think about how this concrete thing that you've landed on, how does that lead logically into the next thing? What questions does it bring up for you? How could you make it more awesome? And as you're scratching, journaling, planning, if anybody starts speaking, then you can go ahead and start working in your script.
And now, if you will join me in welcoming our guest this evening, Mr. Christopher Bays.
Hi, everybody. What's up?
Wonderful.
Hi.
Chris, thank you so much for being here with us this evening.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it looks like you're in the cloud. Where are we finding you this evening?
Well, I'm in Brooklyn, but it's really super, I don't know, it's really windy here. It continues to be super, super windy here in Brooklyn, but we're hoping that's going to pass pretty soon.
Yeah.
Hope I don't have an internet issue.
Yeah, I mean, you have remarkable Wi-Fi for somebody who's in the sky.
Thank you.
You should do a little chit-chatting with people who do the airplane Wi-Fis.
Yeah.
So I want to give you as much time as possible to share your exercises with our audience here tonight, because I know that's why they're here. But I want to provide a little bit of context for everyone before we launch into that. So to do that, I'm just going to ask you here, you're a clown teacher. Could you tell me what that means and what the clown is?
Oh, well, that's a very good question. As a clown teacher, sort of my big goal is to try to help people be a little bit more playful, a little bit more open, a little bit more ferocious, a little more vulnerable. A lot of the work has to do with kind of going back and noticing how we're socialized over time, and how that socialization has diminished our capacity to be fully expressive. And we try to undo that a little bit. We try to ungrow up a little bit so we can get back to our ability to play without so much worry, or our ability to play without needing to solve so much, and perhaps releasing a little bit out of that responsible, organized adult brain that needs to solve everything, and ultimately find our way back to being able to listen to the world and see what the world has to offer you today. Is sort of what I tried to do. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. And it takes a little while, but ultimately I think I hate to put a big definition on what the clown is. It feels a little bit like you're putting a butterfly on a cork board.
Right.
You know what I mean? With pins. But I think ultimately the clown is very personal. It's very unique to each individual, and it's at the end of the day, it's who you would be if you'd never been told no. Right? What would you be like? How would you live in your body? How would you have your voice and breath connection to your delight and to your despair, and to your ability to celebrate and also grieve without feeling that's a place of shame or a place of weakness.
Yeah.
I guess that's the best way I can put it.
Yeah, excellent. And so you've been doing a lot of this work, and then sort of a companion work, the Laughing Club, for the last year. And I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about why the work that you do is so important, especially right now with what performing artists are facing, and the work that you're maybe doing on the Friday Laughing Club. And we'll share a little bit more information at the end of this program about what Laughing Club is. But if you could just talk about why the work you do is important, especially in this moment.
Well, I'm not sure I'm ready to talk about how my work is so important. But
I am.
Thank you for asking me. I think this is, I'll be super honest with you. Back in March, when everything just shut down, I was freaking out because I had no idea how to move forward with the work that I do, because it demands a kind of visceral and kinesthetic connection in the room. It's sweaty, it's wild, and I was like, how do I do that through a computer? And so I began to think, okay, maybe there's another way to proceed. And for many years I've been doing some research in what's called laughter yoga, that was invented by Dr. Kataria. And I've always wanted to, as part of sort of every theater program I've been involved with, to start a laughing club, like every Monday morning or something, right? Where you just get together and you laugh for no particularly good reason about nothing in particular. Just to get your voice moving, to just get your body open. And so I began to look closer at this and think, well, maybe what I can do to start is to begin ongoing wellness practice that is based on this laughter yoga principle, but because in my investigation of it, it was very particular to that person's research. And so I thought, why don't we find a way to bring some of the work that I've been doing over the years in terms of the clown work and the mask work and all of that to find a way to address some of the more complicated emotions of the moment, such as, I don't know about you, but rage is one, maybe some anxiety. Okay, how about some grief? Got that, right? All these things, right, that we're dealing with. And we discovered that laughter is a huge portal to be able to get in there and get in touch with some of that stuff, right? And so I began to investigate that more and more, and over a course of a couple months, I managed to put together a really sweet hour progression of a way for people to connect, for people to stretch out on their laughter. Even if it's fake at the beginning, it doesn't matter. Your body doesn't know the difference. You can fake it till you make it, and you're getting into some toxin. You're purging toxin. You are you're releasing endorphins. It's really good for your cardiovascular system. It's really good for your respiratory system and your immune system. And guess what else? You burn like 40 calories. So I'm like, why am I not doing this every damn day?
Yeah.
Right. So I did it for every damn day for a while.
Yeah.
And
Well,
then and then we began to focus it down and into a really sweet, like, happy hour laughing club on Fridays. And it's been really a beautiful practice for people who show up again and again. And I probably will, I'm guessing, do it forever.
absolutely. And what I was impressed by with Laughing Club is that you do use a lot of the exercises that you use in a clown class as well. I think there are a lot of similarities in that. And something that I wanted to sort of talk about. And so this is the book that you wrote with your creative collaborator, Virginia Scott, that we referenced there. And we'll message everyone about this at the very end. But what I think is so remarkable about this book is that, and we were talking about this previously, is that it gives a sort of trajectory of your curriculum. And so part one focuses on warming up the actor or the performer or the individual's curiosity, both physically and mentally. And the second part moves into something that I would sort of call the essential Christopher Bayes exercise, which is the one that everyone who has worked with you talks about. It's I would say it's maybe an infamous exercise, which is the make us laugh exercise. Could you just sort of describe for our audience what that is and what your objective is with that exercise?
Oh, goodness. Sure. It's sort of like as I worked with Theatre de la Jeune for many years, and one of the French expressions for, like, let's just be honest about it, is let's put the cat on the table.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they think. Let's put the cat on the table. Like, wow, here we go. That's what's up. And so the thing is, like, okay, we're investigating the clown, we're investigating the comic world. I want to do a diagnostic on you. And my way of doing a diagnostic is say, you come over here, you come out there, you come down here to the middle of the stage, the sweet spot, and you make us laugh. You see what happens. It's impossible. It's almost impossible until you get to the point where you realize you're failing miserably. It's awful. And you cop to that. And then you're hilarious.
Yeah.
Because you become human in front of us, right? Because the whole thing is, if you're really good and we laugh at you and we can celebrate that, if you're really horrible and you pretend you're really good, which most people do, we hate you a little bit because you're lying. If you're really awful and you admit that you're awful in that moment, we love you so much because you're being honest. And so it's getting to that kind of really honest relationship between the actor and the audience, that conversation that happens, that's true. And that's the way you begin, I think. There's other clown teachers who do different versions of that, called the circle of fire and all that. And you have to stay in the center until you make everybody laugh, and it's brutal and people are crying. What's that? I'm not trying to traumatize. I don't want to traumatize anybody, but I want you to be honest.
Yeah.
Let's begin with being honest in the conversation. So I guess that's kind of the deal.
I think you've answered the question as to why that happens so early in the class, and that is that was always something that I wondered. It's a diagnostic, and I will say it's not traumatic, but it certainly does. It tests an actor or performer's mettle, and something that I was talking about with a dear friend is that those who think they are the cleverest in the class are typically the ones who have their tricks, their masks, their as you say in this book, their gizmos that they use. And so what are you looking for in an actor? Is it the same thing every time in an actor? How do you know when the mask has fallen? Like, what are the cues for you that let you know as an educator, I am now seeing a glimpse of the clown, that unsocialized pre-know self?
Well, the thing that I'm most interested in, quite honestly, is what each individual's actor's catch place is. Mm-hmm. Right? If they're traveling in a certain way and they hit a place and they go sideways, they go, I'm not going to go there. I'm not doing that. Right? What if they continue to press through that, and what is the vista going to become on the other side of that? But what's the catch place? Right? The catch place is generally bumping right up against the billboard you built for yourself in high school. Right? I'm this kind of person who's that likes these kind of things. Right? This is the billboard that I cling to. Right. And also, I think every actor has part of their talent that they like. that they have confidence in, that they lead with, right? And that's amazing. That's great. I don't want to take that from anybody. I don't want to mess with that. I'm just not interested in that, because that's not a place of discovery or growth. That's a place of defense, right? That's a place that you're gonna cling to. But if I push that aside a little bit, okay, but where's the other part of your talent that's interesting? That's the part of your talent that you like. Where's the part of your talent that's still a mystery to you? And that's my job as an educator, is to try to get in there. I don't care if anybody succeeds in any exercise they ever do. I'm interested in whether they grow or not, whether they make a discovery along the way. That's what's interesting to me. They can have a breakdown, they can fall apart, they can have a celebration, all of these beautiful human, juicy human opportunities. But that doesn't lie in the place where your confidence is. Mm-hmm. That lies in the place of your growth and the mystery. And I'm really interested in the mystery of each individual and what that means. And then how can we push into that to discover something that's all brand new? That's what's really beautiful to me. That's what's poetic, and that's what's hilarious.
Well, let's do it. Let's initiate this here. So I'm going to pass the baton to you. Do you want to give us any sort of preamble before we hop into and you say exercises in your book, and you sort of specify why you say exercise. And I'm curious if before you hop in, if you could just explain. Yeah, exactly. It is.
We're exercising. You don't have to get it right. You don't have to get the treadmill right.
Right. We got our Fitbit or whatever on. Sure.
Yeah. Just go a little further. The further you go, the further you're going to get today. Yeah. If you run up against something you don't want to go there, don't go there. It's up to you. And one of the things, there's a lot of people here, which is amazing. If you want to keep your camera on, keep your camera on. If you want to lurk in the shadows, lurk. That's fine. The lurking is kind of cool too.
I don't think we'll ever have an invitation to lurk again. So this is
your opportunity to lurk if you wish. If you want to get on your feet, you want to make some noise. Here's the thing though. I'm going to ask you to make as much noise as you can possibly get away with. Okay, because I want to get you stretching out in your body and making the sound that goes along with it to match it. All right. So if you need to get a pillow to yell into, or to laugh into, or to rage into, whatever you need to do, get a pillow. If you're fond of your downstairs neighbors, you might want to get some cushions to stomp on. If you don't like them very much, I would say let them complain. Whatever you want to do. But I'm just going to walk you through what I do in Laughing Club. It's short. It's a 20-minute progression, and again, go as far as you feel like you can go tonight. And if it's something that you want to continue later on, come and see me again. I've had people coming every week for 11 months, and it's just a beautiful community and a really gorgeous group of people. So that's what we're going to do. Again, lurk if you wish. If you want to get on your feet, good. We're going to go to gallery view, I think, if we can.
We keep ourselves on mute. What's the best for you?
Stay on mute. Yeah, stay on mute so you can hear me. Otherwise, you're just going to hear each other screaming into the void, which is awesome, but you won't be able to hear a damn thing I say. There we go.